The sky darkened to an ominous green as Winifred Ellis clutched the reins of her wagon with white-knuckled hands, the horses whinnying in terror as the wind began to howl across the Texas plains. She'd been warned about traveling alone, but her determination to reach Bandera before nightfall had clouded her judgment. Now, as the funnel cloud descended from the heavens like God's own fury, she realized her mistake might cost her everything. The year was 1878, and the untamed wilderness of Texas showed no mercy to those who failed to respect its power. Winifred had left her home in St. Louis 3 weeks prior, after her father's passing left her with nothing but debts and painful memories. Her aunt's letter offering her a place in Bandera had been a lifeline, a chance to start anew in a land where nobody knew her name or her shame. The horses screamed as the twister bore down upon them, a writhing serpent of dust and debris. Winifred yanked the reins, desperately trying to turn the wagon toward a small ravine she'd spotted, but the wind was too strong. Her bonnet tore away, her auburn hair whipping around her face as she prayed for salvation that seemed unlikely to come. "Hold!" She screamed to her horses, but her words were swallowed by the roar of the twister. The wagon lurched sideways, the right wheels lifting from the ground. For one suspended moment, Winifred felt weightless, her heart stopping as the full force of the tornado struck. The world became chaos. The wagon flipped, sending her flying through the air. Her last conscious thought was wondering if this was how her life would end alone on the Texas plains, her body never to be found. Ethan Kincaid had weathered many storms in his 30 years, but the twister that tore across his ranch's southern pasture was among the worst he'd seen. From the relative safety of his sturdy cabin, he'd watched the tornado's destructive path with a grim expression, mentally calculating the damage it would leave in its wake. When the skies finally cleared, he saddled his stallion, Diablo, and rode out to check his property and cattle. The tornado had carved a path nearly a quarter-mile wide through his land, uprooting trees and scattering his fences like matchsticks. But it was the unfamiliar debris near Cottonwood Creek that caught his attention: splintered wood, fabric, and the remains of what appeared to be a wagon. "Easy, boy," he murmured to Diablo as they approached the wreckage. The horse's ears flicked nervously, still unsettled from the storm. Ethan dismounted, his spurs jingling as his boots hit the ground, his hand instinctively resting on the revolver at his hip. 8 years as a Texas Ranger had taught him to approach unknown situations with caution. He recognized the remains of a covered wagon, the canvas torn to shreds, and the wooden frame shattered. A trunk had burst open, women's clothing scattered across the grass like colorful butterflies. His heart sank. Travelers caught in storms rarely survived, especially twisters of this magnitude. A soft moan stopped him in his tracks. Drawing his gun, he approached a section of canvas that moved slightly with each gust of wind. Using the barrel of his Colt, he lifted the edge of the fabric. What he saw made him holster his weapon immediately. A woman lay partially covered by the wagon's remains, her face pale beneath streaks of dirt and blood, her breathing shallow but present. She couldn't have been more than 25, with delicate features and hair the color of autumn leaves. "Madam, can you hear me?" Ethan knelt beside her, checking for obvious injuries. A gash on her forehead bled steadily, and her right arm lay at an unnatural angle. "Madam," her eyelids fluttered, revealing eyes the color of summer sage. They focused on him for just a moment before rolling back as consciousness slipped away again. Ethan worked quickly, fashioning a splint for her arm using pieces of the broken wagon and strips torn from the canvas. He needed to get her to his cabin before nightfall, when the coyotes would come to investigate the wreckage. With gentle hands, he lifted her onto Diablo, mounting behind her and cradling her broken body against his chest. "Hold on, madam," he whispered, though he knew she couldn't hear him. "I've got you now." The ride back to his cabin seemed interminable, each jolt causing the woman to whimper in her unconscious state. By the time they arrived, the sun was setting, painting the western sky in shades of crimson and gold. Ethan carried her inside, placing her on his own bed before lighting the lamps and assessing her injuries more thoroughly. The broken arm would need to be set properly. The head wound, while bleeding profusely as head wounds tended to do, didn't appear life-threatening. It was the possibility of internal injuries that concerned him most. He'd seen men die days after seemingly surviving a fall when bleeding inside claimed them. After setting a pot of water to boil, Ethan gathered his limited medical supplies, bandages, whiskey for disinfecting, and a jar of salve his mother had made before her passing. He treated wounded men during his ranger days and injured ranch hands since then, but never a woman. The task before him seemed suddenly intimate in a way that made him uncomfortable. "Forgive me, madam," he murmured as he began cleaning the dirt from her face with a damp cloth. "But I can't leave you like this." He worked methodically, setting her arm and wrapping it securely, cleaning and bandaging the head wound, checking for other injuries. Her dress was torn and dirty, but he couldn't bring himself to remove it completely. Instead, he covered her with a clean blanket once his ministrations were complete. As night fell, Ethan settled into a chair beside the bed, a cup of coffee in one hand and his revolver within reach. He didn't know who this woman was, or why she'd been traveling alone, but he'd keep her safe until she could tell him herself. Winifred awakened to pain and confusion, her head throbbing in rhythm with her heartbeat. The light filtering through unfamiliar windows was too bright, making her wince as she tried to orient herself. She lay in a bed that was not her own, in a room she didn't recognize, with no memory of how she'd arrived there. Attempting to sit up proved a mistake. Sharp pain shot through her right arm and she cried out before she could stop herself. The sound must have alerted someone, for heavy footsteps approached, and the door swung open to reveal a man who filled the frame with his broad shoulders. "You're awake." His voice was deep and gravelly, as if unused to much talking. "Best lie still. That arm's broken pretty bad." Fear seized her heart. She was alone with a stranger, a man in what appeared to be his home. Her mother's warnings about the dangers facing unaccompanied women echoed in her mind. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice weaker than she'd intended. "Where am I?" The man remained in the doorway as if sensing her unease. "Name's Ethan Kincaid. This is my ranch about 10 miles outside of Bandera. Found you in the wreckage of your wagon after yesterday's twister." He paused. "You're lucky to be alive, madam." The twister. Fragments of memory returned: the green sky, the roar of wind, the terror as her wagon was lifted from the ground. She'd been on her way to her aunt's home in Bandera, carrying everything she owned in the world. "My belongings salvaged what I could," he interrupted, gesturing to a small pile of items on a nearby table. "Not much survived intact. Found some letters addressed to Winifred Ellis." "That you?" she nodded, wincing as the movement sent fresh pain through her skull. "Yes, I'm Winifred Ellis. I was traveling to my aunt's home in Bandera." A thought occurred to her. "Do you know Martha Ellis? She runs the millinery shop in town." A shadow crossed his face. "I'm sorry, Miss Ellis. Martha Ellis passed away last winter. Influenza took half the town." His words hit her like a physical blow. Her aunt, her only remaining family, her last hope, was gone. The room seemed to tilt around her as the implications set in. She had nowhere to go, no one to turn to, and now lay injured and dependent on the charity of a stranger. I didn't know," she whispered, fighting tears. Her last letter came 6 months ago. She invited me to join her after my father died. Ethan Kincaid shifted uncomfortably, clearly unaccustomed to dealing with a distressed woman. I'm sorry for your loss, Miss Ellis. You're welcome to stay here until you're well enough to decide what's next. I sent one of my ranch hands to town for the doctor this morning. He should arrive by nightfall. Winifred nodded, too overwhelmed to speak further. The man, Mr. Kincaid, seemed decent enough, but her situation was precarious at best. Alone, injured, and now apparently without prospects or connections in Bandera, her future looked bleak. Rest now, he said, his voice gentler than before. I'll bring you some broth when you're ready. When he left, closing the door softly behind him, Winifred allowed the tears to come. She wept for her father, for her aunt, for the dreams of a new beginning that had shattered as completely as her wagon. When the tears finally subsided, she stared at the ceiling, gathering her strength and her resolve. She'd survived the twister. Somehow she would survive this too, Doctor. Maxwell arrived just after sunset, his weathered face betraying his fatigue from the long ride. Ethan welcomed him with a glass of whiskey and a brief explanation of the situation, before leading him to the bedroom where Miss Ellis rested. I set the arm as best I could, Ethan explained, but I'm no doctor. The older man nodded, setting down his medical bag. Let me see what we're dealing with. Ethan started to leave the room to give them privacy, but the doctor stopped him. I'll need your help, Kincaid. Lady's got no female attendant, and I'm too old to be lifting patients alone. For the next hour, Ethan assisted as Dr. Maxwell properly reset her arm, examined her other injuries, and prescribed rest and careful monitoring. Winifred endured it all with remarkable stoicism, only a few tears escaping when the doctor manipulated her broken bones back into proper alignment. You've had a close call, young lady, Dr. Maxwell said as he packed up his supplies. But you're lucky. No internal injuries that I can detect, and that head wound isn't as bad as it looked. The arm will heal in time. He turned to Ethan. She'll need care for several weeks, can't travel in this condition. Before Ethan could respond, Winifred spoke up from the bed. I cannot impose on Mr. Kincaid's hospitality for weeks, Doctor. Surely there's somewhere in town Bandera's still recovering from last winter's influenza. The doctor interrupted. The boarding house is full of railroad workers, and I wouldn't recommend the rooms above the saloon for a lady. He gave Ethan a meaningful look. Kincaid's place is your best option for now, unless you've got money for a nurse. The silence that followed answered that question clearly enough. Ethan cleared his throat. You're welcome to stay, Miss Ellis. I can move into the bunkhouse with the hands. Absolutely not, she protested. I won't turn you out of your own home. Perhaps I could stay in the bunkhouse. Both men's expressions stopped her mid-sentence, making her realize the impropriety of such an arrangement. I'll arrange for a housekeeper to come out from town, Ethan said finally. Mrs. Donnelly is widowed and could use the work. She can serve as your companion and help around the house. Would that satisfy propriety? Winifred's cheeks flushed with embarrassment and gratitude. You've already done so much, Mr. Kincaid. I don't know how I'll ever repay you. Don't worry about that now, he replied gruffly. Get some rest. As promised, Mrs. Donnelly arrived the next day, a sturdy woman in her 50s with kind eyes and capable hands. She took over Winifred's care with brisk efficiency, freeing Ethan to return to the neglected work of his ranch. The tornado had caused considerable damage to his fences and outbuildings, and several cattle had been lost. For the first week, Winifred barely left the bed, drifting in and out of sleep as her body worked to heal itself. Mrs. Donnelly kept her comfortable, changed her bandages, and helped her with the embarrassing necessities that her injuries made difficult. Ethan kept his distance, appearing only briefly each evening to inquire after her health, before retiring to the small parlor where he'd made a temporary bed. Though the arrangement preserved propriety, Winifred found herself looking forward to these brief interactions, curious about the taciturn man who had saved her life. On the 8th day, feeling stronger, she asked Mrs. Donnelly to help her dress properly and move to the small table by the window. When Ethan returned that evening, dusty and tired from a day of mending fences, he stopped short at the sight of her seated rather than abed. "You're looking better," he observed, removing his hat and running a hand through his dark hair, streaked with premature silver at the temples. "Thanks to your care and Mrs. Donnelly's," she replied. "I thought perhaps I might join you for supper tonight if you don't object. I'm rather tired of staring at these four walls." Something like a smile crossed his face, there and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. "No objection here. I'll wash up." That first meal together was awkward, with conversation starting and stopping like a poorly maintained stagecoach. Ethan was clearly unaccustomed to social niceties, and Winifred was still weak enough that maintaining pleasantries required effort. Yet by the time Mrs. Donnelly served coffee, some of the tension had eased. "Mr. Kincaid," Winifred began hesitantly, "I've been thinking about my situation. I need to find employment in town once I'm well enough. I was wondering if you might know of opportunities in Bandera." He studied her for a long moment. "What skills do you have, Miss Ellis?" The question, though reasonable, made her uncomfortable. The truth was, she had few marketable skills. As the daughter of a once prosperous merchant, she'd been raised to run a household, play the piano, and make polite conversation, none of which would earn her a living in a frontier town. "I can read and write well," she said finally. "I kept my father's accounts after my mother died. I can sew, though not as professionally as my aunt did, and I'm a quick learner." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "Town's growing, the railroad's bringing in new folks every month. School might need a teacher come fall." He paused. "But that's months away. No need to worry about it now." "I cannot stay here indefinitely," she protested. "You've been more than generous, but I must make my own way." "Let's make a deal," he suggested after a moment's consideration. "You need time to heal, and I need help with the books and correspondence for the ranch. My foreman tries, but numbers ain't his strong suit. You can earn your keep that way until you're well enough to seek other employment." Pride warred with practicality in Winifred's mind. She hated being dependent, but his offer provided a solution that allowed her to maintain some dignity. "That seems fair," she agreed finally. "When would you like me to begin?" "Tomorrow's soon enough," he replied, rising from the table. "Good night, Miss Ellis." As Ethan walked out onto the porch for his evening pipe, he questioned his own judgment. Having Winifred Ellis in his home was disrupting the solitary routine he'd carefully constructed over the years. Yet he couldn't bring himself to hasten her departure, not when she had nowhere to go and was still recovering from her injuries. He told himself it was simple Christian charity, the duty of any decent man. But the truth, which he was reluctant to acknowledge even to himself, was that he enjoyed her presence. The house seemed less empty somehow. Even her tentative questions about his background, which he deflected with practiced ease, had stirred something long dormant within him, a desire for genuine connection. 8 years as a Texas Ranger, followed by 5 years of building his ranch, had left little time for social niceties. The people of Bandera respected him but kept their distance, aware of his reputation as a man who preferred solitude to company. Only now, with Winifred's quiet presence in his home, did he realize how lonely that solitude had become. "Foolishness," he muttered to himself, tamping tobacco into his pipe. She would heal, find employment in town, and their paths would diverge. Best not to grow accustomed to having her around. The next morning, Ethan brought a stack of ledgers and correspondence to the kitchen table. Winifred was already seated there, her hair neatly braided and her borrowed dress, one of Mrs. Donnelly's, altered to fit her smaller frame, freshly pressed. Though still pale, her eyes were clear and alert. "These are the ranch accounts," he explained, setting down the books. "Been neglecting them since my foreman, Jenkins, took a fall from his horse 2 months back. He handled most of the paperwork before that." Winifred opened the top ledger and frowned at the disorganized entries. "I see," she said diplomatically. "And what exactly is your business, Mr. Kincaid?" "Cattle ranching, I presume." "Cattle, yes. But also horses. I breed and train them for the army and private buyers. It's the horses that turn the real profit." She nodded, already making mental notes about how to better organize the accounts. "And these letters?" He gestured to a pile of unopened correspondence. "Orders, inquiries, bills. Been too busy with spring calving and then the tornado damage to deal with them." For the next few hours, Winifred immersed herself in bringing order to chaos. The work was soothing, giving her mind something to focus on besides pain and uncertainty. Ethan left her to it, heading out to oversee the rebuilding of a damaged barn. By midday, she had sorted the correspondence into neat piles and begun drafting replies for his approval. The ledgers would take longer to untangle, but she'd made a start, creating a more logical system for recording income and expenses. When Ethan returned for the noon meal, he seemed surprised by her progress. "You work fast," he observed, reviewing her organized stacks. "I enjoy creating order," she replied. "My father's business affairs were often chaotic. I learned to manage them despite his resistance to proper bookkeeping." Something in her tone made Ethan look at her more closely. "Your father, was he a difficult man?" Winifred hesitated. She rarely spoke of her father's decline, the gambling that had destroyed their fortune, the drinking that had destroyed his health. "He faced many challenges after my mother's death," she said finally. "Business setbacks, poor investments." Ethan nodded, sensing her reluctance to elaborate. "Well, I'm grateful for your help. These books have been a thorn in my side for months." As the days passed, a routine developed. Mornings were devoted to ranch business, with Winifred gradually taking over correspondence and bookkeeping entirely. Afternoons, she rested or sat on the porch, watching the activities of the ranch from a distance. Evenings, they shared meals, their conversations gradually becoming less stilted as they grew more comfortable with each other's company. 2 weeks after her arrival, Dr. Maxwell returned to check her progress. He pronounced her healing well, though the arm would need to remain in the splint for several more weeks. "You're lucky, young lady," he repeated his earlier assessment. "Many wouldn't have survived what you did." "I've had excellent care," she replied, glancing at Ethan, who stood awkwardly in the doorway. After the doctor left, Ethan found Winifred on the porch, staring out at the rolling hills of his property. The spring wildflowers were in full bloom, painting the landscape in vibrant blues, reds, and yellows. "Doc says you're mending well," he said, leaning against the porch railing. "Yes." She hesitated, then continued. "Mr. Kincaid, I've been thinking about our arrangement. The work I'm doing for you, it's hardly equal to the care and lodging you've provided. I feel I'm taking advantage of your generosity." He shook his head. "You've done more with those books in 2 weeks than Jenkins managed in 2 years. If anything, I'm getting the better deal." A small smile touched her lips. "You're kind to say so, but we both know that's not true." She took a deep breath. "I'd like to do more, contribute more, Mrs. Donnelly mentioned you haven't had a proper housekeeper since your mother passed away. With her help, I could take on some of those duties as well. Ethan frowned. You're still recovering, and you're a guest, not a servant. I'm neither an invalid nor a guest, she countered. I'm a woman without resources who needs to earn her keep. Please, Mr. Kincaid, allow me this dignity. Something in her expression, determination mingled with pride, made him reconsider his objection. He recognized that need for independence, the desire to stand on one's own feet rather than accept charity. All right, he conceded, but nothing too strenuous until that arm's fully healed. The smile that illuminated her face made his heart skip a beat, a reaction that both surprised and disturbed him. Thank you, Mr. Kincaid. Ethan, he said suddenly, if you're going to be running my household, you might as well use my given name. She nodded, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. And you must call me Winifred. That exchange marked a subtle shift in their relationship. With Winifred gradually assuming management of the household, Ethan found his home transformed. Rooms long unused were aired and cleaned. Meals became more varied and flavorful. Fresh cut wildflowers appeared on the table, and curtains that had hung limp for years were washed and rehung. More significantly, the atmosphere changed. The house, which had served merely as shelter for so long, began to feel like a home again. Ethan found himself lingering over meals, enjoying Winifred's conversations about books she'd discovered in his mother's old trunk, or her observations about the ranch operations. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching a spectacular sunset paint the western sky, Ethan realized with a start that he was happier than he'd been in years. The recognition unsettled him. Happiness had never been his goal, just survival, independence, and the building of something that would last. Yet here it was, creeping up on him unawares, wrapped in the presence of a woman who had literally been thrown into his life by a twist of fate. "You're quiet tonight," Winifred observed, her voice interrupting his thoughts. "Just thinking," he replied, unwilling to share the true nature of his reflections. She nodded, seemingly content with his vague response. "It's beautiful here, so different from St. Louis. Do you miss the city?" He asked, genuinely curious. She considered the question before answering. "I miss certain aspects, the libraries, the concerts, the bustle of so many people." She paused, looking out at the vast expanse of land that comprised the Kincaid Ranch. "But there's something about this openness that speaks to me, a sense of possibility that St. Louis never had." "Possibility," he repeated, testing the word. "That's what drew me here after I left the Rangers, land a man could shape with his own hands. You were a Texas Ranger." Her eyes widened with interest. "You never mentioned that." Ethan rarely discussed his past, especially the 8 years he'd spent upholding the law in some of Texas's most dangerous territories. The violence he'd witnessed and sometimes perpetrated in the name of justice had left scars that weren't visible but ran deep. "Long time ago," he said dismissively. "Different life." She studied him for a moment as if seeing beyond his casual deflection. "It shaped you, though, I can tell." Her perceptiveness was uncomfortable. "How's that?" "The way you're always aware of your surroundings, how you position yourself in a room." She smiled slightly. "The revolver you never go without, even here on your own property." He hadn't realized she'd noticed these habits, ingrained from years when vigilance meant survival. "Old habits," he acknowledged. "Were you a good ranger?" she asked, her directness catching him off guard. "Effective," he answered after a moment's consideration. "Not sure good is the right word." "I think it must be," she said softly. "A man who would stop to save a stranger from tornado wreckage, who would open his home to her recovery, must have been a good ranger too." Her faith in his inherent goodness was both touching and troubling. Ethan had done things in his ranger days that would shock her. Actions justified by law, but sometimes questionable in the harsh light of conscience. Yet her words warmed something cold within him, a place that had long ago accepted his own moral ambiguity as the price of survival in a violent land. "You see the best in people, Winifred," he said finally. "That's a rare quality out here." "Not the best," she corrected him. "Just the truth as I observe it. My father taught me one valuable lesson among his many failures: judge people by their actions, not their words or reputations." The mention of her father reminded Ethan how little he knew of her past. "You don't speak much about your family," she sighed, her expression growing distant. "There's not much to tell that's pleasant. My mother died when I was 16. My father's business began failing soon after, though I didn't understand why until later. He turned to gambling, thinking to recoup his losses." She shook her head. "By the time he died, there was nothing left but debts." "I'm sorry," Ethan said, meaning it. "That's a heavy burden for a young woman." "Your sympathy means more than you know," she replied. "In St. Louis, there was only judgment. The daughter of Winifred Ellis, once respected merchant, now disgraced gambler, doors that had been open-closed. Former friends crossed the street to avoid speaking with me." Anger flared in Ethan's chest at the thought of her being shunned for her father's mistakes. "People can be cruel." "Yes," she agreed, "but sometimes they can be unexpectedly kind, too." Her eyes met his, warm with gratitude and something more complex that he couldn't quite identify. The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken emotions. Ethan found himself noticing details he tried to ignore: the graceful curve of her neck, the way the fading sunlight brought out auburn highlights in her hair, the intelligence that animated her expression. He stood abruptly, breaking the spell. "It's getting late. I should check the horses before turning in." If she was disappointed by his sudden withdrawal, she didn't show it. "Of course. Good night, Ethan." As he walked toward the stables, Ethan cursed himself for a fool. Winifred Ellis was his responsibility, a woman under his protection. He had no business noticing the shape of her lips or wondering how her hair would look unbound. Once she was fully recovered, she would leave for town and build her own life, as she should. Getting attached would only lead to complications neither of them needed. Yet that night, as he lay on his makeshift bed in the parlor, Ethan found himself listening to the soft sounds of her movement in his bedroom, wondering what it might be like if she were to stay not out of necessity, but by choice. June arrived with blazing heat and the busiest time of the ranching year. Ethan and his men worked from dawn until dusk, branding calves, moving herds to summer pastures, and continuing repairs from the tornado damage. He returned each evening exhausted, covered in dust and sweat, to find his home transformed in subtle ways that made it more welcoming than it had been in years. Winifred's arm had healed enough that she no longer needed the splint, though she still favored it. Dr. Maxwell had pronounced her ready for more activity, and she had embraced her expanded role with enthusiasm. Under Mrs. Donnelly's tutelage, she was learning to cook Texas style, mastering the art of biscuits and gravy, beef stew and corn bread that rivaled the older woman's. More importantly, she had brought order to the chaotic business side of the ranch. The ledgers were now meticulously maintained, correspondence was answered promptly, and she had even created a system for tracking the lineage and training progress of Ethan's prize horses. One evening in mid-June, as Ethan sat at the kitchen table enjoying a piece of fresh baked apple pie, Winifred presented him with a summary of the ranch's finances for the first half of the year. "I thought you might like to see the overall picture," she explained, spreading the papers before him. "You're doing quite well, especially with the horse breeding operation. The Army contract is particularly profitable. Ethan studied the neat columns of figures with amazement. He'd always run the ranch by instinct, focusing on the day-to-day work and trusting that the profits would take care of themselves. Seeing everything laid out so clearly was both satisfying and somewhat intimidating. "This is impressive work," he admitted. "Never realized quite how much those cavalry horses were bringing in." She smiled, pleased by his approval. "I've also taken the liberty of drafting a letter to Colonel Harrison about potentially expanding the contract next year." His last correspondence suggested the Army's need for good mounts is increasing with the new forts being established further west. Ethan signed the letter without hesitation, trusting her judgment. Over the past weeks, he'd come to rely on her business acumen as much as her household management. The realization was unsettling. He'd prided himself on self-sufficiency for so long that dependence on anyone, even someone as competent as Winifred, felt like a potential weakness. Yet he couldn't deny the results. The ranch was running more smoothly than ever, and for the first time, he had a clear vision of its financial future. Moreover, returning to the house each evening had become the highlight of his day, rather than simply the end of work. As June turned to July, the question of Winifred's eventual departure loomed larger. Her injuries were fully healed, and there was no medical reason for her to remain at the ranch. Yet neither of them broached the subject, continuing their comfortable routine as if it might go on indefinitely. Mrs. Donnelly, who came 3 days a week now that Winifred could manage most household tasks alone, was the first to mention it. "Town's talking," she informed Ethan bluntly one afternoon when Winifred was occupied elsewhere. "Single man, single woman living under the same roof for months now. Folks are wondering about your intentions." Ethan frowned. "Miss Ellis is still recovering from her injuries." The older woman snorted. "She's fit as a fiddle now, and we both know it. Either you need to make an honest woman of her, or help her find a situation in town before her reputation's beyond salvaging." The suggestion that he might marry Winifred sent a jolt through Ethan that was equal parts alarm and something dangerously like hope. "That's between Miss Ellis and me," he said firmly. "And I'd appreciate if you'd remind the gossips that she nearly died in that tornado. Christian charity shouldn't be the subject of idle speculation." Mrs. Donnelly raised an eyebrow, unimpressed by his deflection. "Christian charity don't usually involve the kind of looks you two exchange when you think nobody's watching. Just saying, Mr. Kincaid. Time to fish or cut bait." After she left, Ethan remained in the barn, methodically brushing down his stallion while turning her words over in his mind. Had he been that transparent? And more importantly, had Winifred noticed? The thought that she might have observed his growing attraction was mortifying. She depended on his protection, his hospitality. The last thing she needed was to feel pressured by unwelcome attentions from the man whose roof she lived under. Yet, Mrs. Donnelly's warning about town gossip couldn't be ignored. Bandera was small enough that talk could damage Winifred's prospects for employment and social acceptance. He needed to address the situation, uncomfortable as that conversation might be. That evening, after a quieter-than-usual supper, Ethan cleared his throat. "Winifred, there's something we should discuss." She looked up from her sewing, her expression curious. "Yes." He struggled to find the right words. "You've been here nearly 3 months now. Your injuries are healed." Understanding dawned in her eyes. "You're asking when I plan to leave." "No," he said quickly. "That's not. I mean, you're welcome to stay as long as you need, but Mrs. Donnelly mentioned that there's talk in town, about us, about the propriety of our arrangement." A blush colored her cheeks. "I see. I should have anticipated that. Small towns run on gossip after all." "It's not fair to you," Ethan continued. "Your reputation shouldn't suffer because of my hospitality. I can speak with the school board about that teaching position, or there might be work at the general store." Winifred set aside her sewing, her hands folding in her lap. "That's very considerate of you, Ethan. But before we discuss my departure, I think there's something else we should address." He tensed, uncertain what she meant. "These past months," she continued, her voice steady despite the color in her cheeks, "I've come to value your friendship greatly. But I've also sensed that perhaps there might be more than friendship developing, at least on my part." Her courage faltered slightly, but she pressed on. "If I've misinterpreted, please forgive my presumption, but before I make plans to leave, I needed to speak honestly." Ethan stared at her, thunderstruck by her directness. Women in his experience didn't speak so plainly about matters of the heart. Yet here was Winifred, laying her feelings before him with the same straightforward honesty she brought to everything. "You haven't misinterpreted," he said finally, his voice rougher than he intended. "But your situation, you're dependent on my hospitality. It wouldn't be right for me to take advantage." A smile touched her lips. Always the honorable man. "Ethan, I may have arrived here through circumstances beyond my control, but I've stayed by choice these past weeks. I could have gone to town, found employment, moved on. I stayed because I wanted to be here, with you." The admission hung between them, changing everything and nothing all at once. Ethan found himself at a crossroads he'd never expected to face again after burying his heart alongside his ranger badge years ago. "I'm not an easy man, Winifred," he warned. 8 years enforcing laws in places where they weren't wanted left marks that don't show. I've killed men, made enemies. There are nightmares I'll never be free of. We all have scars," she replied softly. "Some are just more visible than others." He moved to sit beside her, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her green eyes. "What are you saying exactly?" "I'm saying that if there's a chance for something more between us, I'd like to explore it. And if not, then yes, it's time I moved to town and established my independence." The simplicity of her proposition belied its profound implications. Ethan had built his life around solitude, convinced that the violence of his past had made him unsuitable for the gentler connections most men took for granted. Yet here was this remarkable woman, offering possibility where he'd seen only closed doors. "I'm not good with words," he admitted. "Never have been, but I'd like you to stay. Not as my housekeeper or bookkeeper, not out of charity or obligation." He paused, gathering his courage. "I'd like to court you properly, Winifred Ellis, if you'll allow it." The smile that illuminated her face was answer enough, but her words confirmed it. "I'd like that very much, Ethan Kincaid." That night, for the first time since Winifred had arrived at his ranch, Ethan slept soundly, without the restless dreams that usually plagued him. The future, which had always been a straight line of work and solitude stretching to the horizon, now held unexpected curves and possibilities he'd never allowed himself to imagine. News of their courtship spread quickly through Bandera and the surrounding ranches. The reaction was mixed surprise that the reclusive Kincaid had finally shown interest in a woman, coupled with speculation about Winifred's character and background. Some of the town's more established families viewed her with suspicion, a stranger with no connections or fortune whose claim to respectability was tenuous at best. Yet others, particularly those who had experienced Ethan's fair dealing and quiet generosity over the years, were more welcoming. Mrs. Donnelly became Winifred's staunchest defender, shutting down gossip with pointed remarks about Christian charity and second chances. For Winifred, the transition from dependent guest to acknowledged courtship brought both relief and new anxieties. Though she no longer worried about imposing on Ethan's hospitality, she was acutely aware of the scrutiny their relationship faced. Having experienced social ostracism in St. Louis after her father's disgrace, she feared similar rejection in her new home. Ethan, observing her tension when they made their first public appearance together at Sunday services, resolved to address the situation directly. After church, he guided her through the churchyard to where several prominent citizens gathered, including Judge Wilson and his wife, the most influential couple in Bandera. "Judge, Mrs. Wilson," he greeted them with unusual formality. "I'd like to introduce Miss Winifred Ellis. As you may have heard, we're officially courting." Mrs. Wilson, a thin woman with sharp eyes that missed nothing, assessed Winifred from bonnet to boots. "Miss Ellis, I understand you were caught in that terrible twister back in May. Providence must have been watching over you." "Indeed it was, madam," Winifred replied, meeting the older woman's gaze steadily. "Mr. Kincaid's kindness was the instrument of that providence." The judge harumphed approvingly. Always knew Kincaid was a decent sort, ranger background notwithstanding. He turned to Ethan. "Heard you're expanding that Army horse contract. Smart business." As the conversation shifted to horses and ranch matters, Winifred felt Mrs. Wilson's continued scrutiny. Finally, the older woman spoke quietly, while the men were engaged in discussion. "You should know, Miss Ellis, that Ethan Kincaid is well respected in this community. His choice of companion reflects on him." The implication was clear. Winifred's behavior would be closely observed and judged. "I'm quite aware of Mr. Kincaid's standing, Mrs. Wilson. And I assure you, I value his reputation as highly as my own." Something in her dignified response seemed to satisfy the older woman. "Well then, perhaps you'll join our Ladies' Aid Society. We meet Wednesdays to sew for the orphanage in San Antonio." The invitation, though coolly delivered, represented acceptance of a sort. "I'd be honored," Winifred replied, recognizing it as the olive branch it was intended to be. As they rode home afterward, Ethan noticed her thoughtful expression. "You handled Mrs. Wilson well," he remarked. "She's the gatekeeper to Bandera society, such as it is." Winifred smiled wryly. "I recognized the type immediately. Every town has its Mrs. Wilson's women who guard social boundaries with the vigilance of Cerberus at the gates of Hades." Her literary reference made him chuckle. "Never thought of it that way, but it fits. She invited me to join the Ladies' Aid Society. I suspect it's as much to keep an eye on me as to gain another pair of hands for sewing." "Likely so," he agreed. "But it's a start. This town. They're good people mostly, but they're cautious with strangers. Give them time." His understanding warmed her heart. "Thank you for introducing me to them. I know socializing isn't your preference." Ethan shrugged, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Wanted them to see you as I do. Or at least start to." The simple statement revealed more than perhaps he intended about the depth of his feelings. Winifred felt a rush of affection for this complex man who could face down armed outlaws without flinching, yet found expressing emotions so challenging. Their courtship progressed through the summer with a combination of private moments at the ranch and carefully chosen public appearances in Bandera. Ethan, who had avoided town gatherings for years, found himself attending socials, church picnics, and even a dance held to celebrate Independence Day. For Winifred, these months brought a growing sense of belonging, both to the community and to Ethan himself. Their evenings on the porch became precious opportunities for deeper conversation, as they gradually shared the experiences that had shaped them. She told him about her mother's long illness, her father's descent into gambling and alcohol, and the painful lessons in self-reliance that had followed. He, in turn, shared carefully edited stories from his ranger days and the dreams that had led him to establish the ranch. By September, when the first hint of autumn crispness touched the evening air, they had developed a comfortable rhythm, a partnership that extended beyond romance to the practical management of the ranch itself. Winifred's organizational skills complemented Ethan's practical knowledge of cattle and horses, creating an operation more efficient and profitable than either could have achieved alone. It was on a golden September afternoon, as they rode together to check on a new foal born to one of Ethan's prize mares, that he finally spoke the words that had been building in his heart for months. They had dismounted near a creek that cut through the eastern pasture, letting the horses drink while they stretched their legs. The cottonwoods along the water's edge were just beginning to show hints of yellow among their green leaves, and wildflowers nodded in the gentle breeze. "My mother loved this spot," Ethan said, breaking a comfortable silence. "Said it was the prettiest place on the whole ranch." Winifred smiled, shading her eyes against the sun as she surveyed the peaceful scene. "She was right. It's beautiful." He nodded, uncharacteristically nervous. "Been thinking about building a new house. This one. The main house is getting too small for the operation we're running now. Need more room for proper offices, guest quarters for buyers coming to see the horses." "That's a wonderful idea," she agreed. "Where would you build it?" "Here," he said simply, "if you approve." The implication of his words took a moment to register. When they did, Winifred turned to face him fully, her heart racing. "If I approve? Ethan, what are you saying?" He reached into his pocket, withdrawing a small object that glinted in the sunlight. "Rode into San Antonio last week. Wanted to do this right." The ring he held was a simple gold band set with a small diamond, modest by St. Louis standards, but more meaningful than any ostentatious jewel could have been. Winifred's breath caught in her throat as he awkwardly lowered himself to one knee before her. "I told you I'm not good with words," he began, his voice rougher than usual. "But I love you, Winifred Ellis. Never thought I'd say those words to any woman after the life I've led. Never thought I deserved to, but loving you, it's made me want to be worthy of you." Tears blurred her vision as emotion overwhelmed her. "Oh, Ethan, will you marry me?" he asked simply. "Build a life with me here. It won't always be easy. Ranch life never is. But I swear I'll do everything in my power to make you happy." The answer required no thought, no weighing of options. In the 4 months since a tornado had thrown her into his life, Winifred had found more than shelter. She'd found her place in the world, alongside a man whose strength and gentleness had captured her heart completely. "Yes," she whispered, tears streaming freely now. "Yes, I'll marry you, Ethan Kincaid." His hands trembled slightly as he slipped the ring onto her finger. Then he was on his feet, pulling her into an embrace that expressed what words could not: the wonder, the gratitude, the overwhelming joy of finding love when neither had been looking for it. Their wedding took place on the first Saturday in October, a perfect autumn day with clear skies and moderate temperatures. The ceremony was held at the Baptist Church in Bandera, with reception to follow at the ranch. Despite Ethan's preference for privacy, they had agreed on a proper wedding with the whole community, invited a declaration that Winifred was no longer a stranger but a permanent part of Bandera. Mrs. Wilson had taken it upon herself to assist with arrangements, a clear signal of social acceptance that meant more to Winifred than she cared to admit. Other members of the Ladies' Aid Society contributed dishes for the wedding feast, while Ethan's ranch hands transformed the barn into a suitable venue for dancing, hanging lanterns from the rafters and clearing the central space of equipment. Standing before the altar, listening to the minister's words about union and commitment, Winifred felt a profound sense of rightness. She had traveled to Texas seeking refuge with a relative she barely knew, only to lose everything in a destructive twist of nature. Yet that same destruction had led her to this moment, to this man whose steady gaze promised a future she could never have imagined in her darkest days in St. Louis. When they exchanged vows, Ethan's voice was firm and clear, as if he'd been waiting all his life to speak these particular words. Winifred's response was equally certain, her heart too full for doubt or hesitation. The simple gold band that joined the engagement ring on her finger felt like the most natural thing in the world, as if it had always been meant to rest there. The celebration afterward was unlike anything Bandera had seen in years. Ranchers and townspeople alike gathered to feast, drink, and dance in honor of the union between the formerly reclusive Kincaid and the woman who had quite literally been blown into his life. The gossip that had once questioned the propriety of their arrangement had transformed into romantic speculation about divine intervention. Surely only the hand of God could have arranged such a perfect match through such unlikely means. As twilight deepened into night, lanterns illuminated the yard between house and barn, casting a golden glow over the festivities. Ethan, who had endured the socializing with remarkable patience, finally claimed his bride for a private moment, leading her away from the celebration to the quiet of the porch. "Happy, Mrs. Kincaid?" he asked, his arm around her waist. The new name sent a thrill through her. "Completely," she assured him, leaning into his solid strength. "Though I think I might have scandalized Mrs. Wilson by dancing 3 times with my own husband." He chuckled, the sound rumbling pleasantly against her side. "Reckon she'll forgive you. Even saw her smile once or twice today." "A miracle indeed," Winifred laughed. "Almost as miraculous as a twister delivering me to your doorstep." "Not your doorstep," he corrected. "Found you a good half-mile away, remember, had to carry you home." Home. The word encompassed everything she'd found here: safety, purpose, love. "I'm glad you did," she said softly. "Glad you were the one who found me." His kiss was tender, a promise of the life they would build together. When they reluctantly returned to their guests, it was with the private knowledge that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as they had begun, side by side, stronger together than apart. The years that followed proved Ethan's warning: true ranch life was never easy. There were droughts that threatened the cattle, harsh winters that claimed livestock despite their best efforts, economic downturns that made buyers scarce for even the finest horses. Yet there were triumphs too: the completion of their new house on the creek the following spring, the expansion of the horse breeding operation to include a line of quarter horses that quickly gained reputation throughout Texas, and most precious of all, the birth of their children. Their first, a son they named William after Winifred's mother, arrived just before their 2nd anniversary. A daughter, Elizabeth, followed 2 years later, and finally another son, James, completed their family. The children grew strong in the fresh air and open spaces of the ranch, learning to ride almost before they could walk, developing the self-reliance and practical skills that frontier life demanded. Winifred never lost her appreciation for the twist of fate that had brought her to Ethan. Each spring, when the storm season returned to the Texas plains, she would stand on the porch of their home, watching the dramatic skies with a mixture of respect and gratitude. The destructive power that had nearly claimed her life had also, paradoxically, given her everything she now cherished. On the 10th anniversary of the tornado that had thrown her wagon off the trail, Ethan surprised her with a special gift: a small gold pendant shaped like a twisting funnel cloud, with a tiny diamond embedded at its center. "To remind us," he said as he fastened it around her neck, "that sometimes destruction leads to creation. That loss can open the door to finding something more precious." Winifred touched the pendant, tears welling in her eyes. "Who would have thought," she whispered, "that the worst day of my life would lead to all my greatest blessings?" He drew her close, his arms as strong and sure as they had been when he'd first carried her from the wreckage to safety. "That's life on the frontier," he said simply. "Danger and opportunity, side by side. Just takes the courage to see one through to find the other." As their children called from the yard, eager to show their parents a nest of rabbits they'd discovered, Winifred and Ethan exchanged a smile of perfect understanding. The twister that had once threatened to end her journey had instead been just the beginning, the violent wind that had blown her not off course, but precisely where she was always meant to be.